as David said, the first book came out in 2008, and it was red. It's now green. There's nothing to read into that. It's just the same edition. It has to be a different colour. And it was an exercise in a large international NGO in Swiss Oxfam saying, do we actually have a story, a common overall story about development? Can we put out some competition to the aid economists, or do we actually just have to let everybody else decide whether we believe just acts or beliefs to them? You know, there must be more to life than just choosing between these guys. It involved an enormous consultation. This is an NGO we're talking about here, very participatory, very slow, very tedious. And about 500 people were involved for 2 years, and eventually outcropped a large book. And the message that came out of this enormous consultation was, I think, a bit new for Oxfam, which is that if you care about development, then you should look in two places, primarily. If you care about development in the narrow sense of rising incomes, GDP per capita, economies growing, freeing up people to put food on the table, get their kids into school, progress in that material way, then what you essentially need are effective states. These are effective states like the Asian developmental states, but also Botswana, fastest growing economy in the world for the last 50 years, or several very, very effective states in Latin America. And what do those states do? They invest in infrastructure, they ensure that their people are healthy and educated, they ensure security, and they have a plan for the country. They upgrade, they don't just stay doing what they're doing. Korea started its rise in the 1950s, and that point its main export was wings, with human hair. It did not say, we have a great comparative advantage in wings, we're going to stick with what we're good at. They actually did have an industrial policy which took them right up into an industrial power. And that was kind of an uncomfortable message for my colleagues in Oxfam and other NGOs. People argued about the adjective. They said, effective sounds a bit brutal, a bit, nasty. Can we have participative? Can we have responsive, accountable, friendly, nice, cuddly? Could we have a cuddly state? And I said, that's fine, as long as you're willing to apply that adjective to China and then put that on the front of the cover, that's good. And people sort of went, because one of the things in development, which we all do, is believe our own rhetoric. DFID, until recently, was putting out papers saying, with total certainty, unless you have democratic, elected governments and good governments, you cannot have sustained growth. And you just look at them, have they actually looked around? Or do they believe their own, they're in the bubble, And NGOs spend a lot of time in the bubble. So the effective state bit got people out of the bubble, but then I put them straight back in the bubble, because if you care about development in the broader sense, the Amartya Sen sense of freedoms to be and to do, and expanding those freedoms is what development is about, then what matters in development is broad. It's about people in the sense of agency and power, people coming together to change their situations, rights, organisation, active citizens. And obviously the NGOs are delighted with that. And then the interesting bit for us, I think, is that increasingly we find ourselves moving in the space between the active citizens and the effective states. What can we do to bring them together, maybe at a local level, maybe at a national level? How can we strengthen active citizens' movements? How can we actually strengthen states in many cases? And how do both of those relate to markets in those countries, whether big private sector or small private sector? So we're moving in the spaces between those places. And I think that's become clearer as time's gone on. But that was 2008. And then last year, if you want to keep a book alive, you have to go back every 5 years or so and do the edition. So I went back last year, very traumatic. Okay, when you've written a book and then you just forget it. You never read your own book. And you go back and you reread it and you think, wow, things have changed. You panic. I started thinking about financial system and thought, oh no, there's been a huge financial crisis. So you go back and you comb through the pages. And I found one reference to storm clouds growing over the world economy. As a sigh of relief. I predicted the global financial crisis was okay. So you have to work your way through this kind of crisis stuff, and then you can relax, and then you actually you have the luxury, in my case, thank you Oxfam, of sitting back and thinking what's really changed in the last 5 years. And that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm not just going to do the book pitch, I'll talk about what's different. And lots of things haven't changed, as we've seen about. But I'll talk about the things that have changed and what it's done to our thinking on development. And I'm going to have to keep myself going with coffee because I've got a very early today. Okay, so the first big shock. What we've seen in the last 5 years is wave after wave of very different shocks sweeping over our world, both in terms of our actual world and in terms of the development world. First big shock, 2008, 2009, a global financial crisis which stopped being global quite quickly. It became very European, very North American, not very African or East Asian, not very Latin American. So I think, yeah, global financial crisis, partly, definitely a financial crisis. And what it made us think is that we really haven't paid enough attention to finance as a system. Is finance too big? Is it too volatile? How well regulated is it? Could it be better regulated? What influence does it have on politics and power and how decisions are made? And these are the kind of things that we haven't really engaged with prior to 2008. Since 2008, I think we struggled to find a point of entry. No one comes to Oxfam and asks us how to redesign bond clauses. Yeah, quite right. I wouldn't want Oxfam anywhere near that. But we have found certain things which we think are worth working on in finance. Tax havens. Suddenly, cash-strapped governments around the world are desperate to find new sources of revenues. So governments that would previously have listened to the financial lobby are now more willing to listen to people saying, can we do something about tax havens, please? Can we stop tax evasion? International financial taxes, financial transaction taxes. 40 years ago, James Tobin proposed a very small tax on every transaction that goes across borders. So absolutely no way. A financial crisis hits, and suddenly doors open, and 11 countries in Europe are introducing a financial transactions tax over the next period. This is kind of an interesting historical pattern. This is what happens in big crises. And this is another kind of lesson, I think, from the financial crisis. In the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, in my country, Britain, the government said we have to pay for this terrible war against Napoleon. So we're going to raise this very small tax. It's going to be temporary and small, and we promise we'll take it away when the war's finished. We're going to call it the income tax. And what happens is that these taxes are introduced on the back of crises, and then they never go away. So once the European Union introduces the FTT, it will raise, they reckon, about $30 billion a year. Unfortunately, my colleagues in the NGO group are still fondly believing that that money is going to be spent on development and environment. Yeah, right. There's going to be then a second show to actually figure that for the kind of things we work on. But at least once the flow is there, it probably will stay. So I think there's an interesting sort of side effect of the crisis. But if you went around the developing world in 2009 and you talked to poor people and said, tell me about the crisis, how is it affecting you? They didn't think you were talking about the financial crisis. They thought you were talking about food. Because at the same time as the financial crisis hit, something really extraordinary happened to the world food system. It went into a kind of massive spasm, it had a heart attack, and it's still having that heart attack. Prices have been falling steadily, and prices were smooth and forward for 30 years prior to 2008. In 2008, they went through the roof, and now they've been going over riots in 30 countries and sort of mayhem everywhere. And then they've been going up and down ever since. Now, that registered in Britain, where people spend an average of 15% of the household income on food. Yeah, so suddenly food got more expensive, people felt it in their family budget. Imagine you're in Bangladesh spending 70% of your budget on food, and food prices double. Do the math. So, we did some interesting research going around, we're currently going around 10 countries, doing kind of focus group work, asking people, how has this shift in the food system affected you? And we're finding a much deeper impact than just nutrition. I've got a report coming up next week called Squeeze, which will summarise the first year's research in 10 countries. And it's affecting every aspect of people's lives. Quote from Bangladesh. Birthdays and weddings are now things for rich people. The ritual cycle has been sort of postponed because all the money's going on food. Women saying, I can't afford makeup, therefore I can't go out, and so I just have to stay at home. When was the last aid report which you ever read, which admitted that poor people want to wear makeup? Or go to parties, terrible. So it's affecting that. It's affecting relations within the household. It's leading to, seems to be leading to greater tensions, men losing jobs or women going out to work. It's led us to look more at what's going on within households. I'll talk about that in a minute. It's also led to some unfortunate side effects. When food prices go up, land values go up, countries get worried about relying on imports, and if you're a country with a lot of money and you're very import dependent, you think, I think I'm going to go and buy half of Madagascar. There's been a wave of land grabs, huge land, large-scale land acquisitions since 2008, which Oxfam actually worried about doing quite a big global campaign on. They happen mainly in countries with poor governments. We've sort of done the comparison. And they can lead to quite a lot of poor farmers being expelled from the land in order, sometimes to grow nothing. It's purely speculative. People get the land, they know the value's going to go up because of what's happening with the food system, so they just get the land and sit on it. To grow biofuels for people's gas tanks, or occasionally to grow food, but that food will be for the investing country, not the local people. So we're quite worried about the systemic impacts of land growth. Final point on food prices. This picture was taken by a researcher who went rogue in Zambia. She was supposed to be doing a proper focus group, discussion, producing lots of tedious transcripts, and she just got out a camera and asked a group of women to show what they could have bought a year ago and what they could buy today. And this has been by far the most useful piece of research. So the lesson for all you students in there is ignore your instructions a bit. Do the bit you're paid to do, and then do something extra, and that might work. The third shock was a positive shock, the Arab Spring. Okay, now the Arab Spring came from nowhere. The origin was a market trader in a small town in Tunisia who had his scales confiscated by a female police officer. He was so humiliated by this that he actually committed suicide, pushed him over the edge. He set fire to himself. So a very spectacular way to go. That spread, some of it through Twitter and Facebook, so the Twitterati got very excited. And protests started building up, overthrow of the Tunisian government, domino effect, overthrow of Mubarak in Egypt. Absolutely unpredictable. You could not have predicted, and I'll come back to this, that act against that market trader would have led to the fall of Mubarak. Completely unpredictable. Made us think much more about the women's movement in Muslim societies, in the majority of Muslim countries, because women were front and centre of the protest movement. We'd already been doing some interesting work on women's rights in Muslim context. We've been doing a lot since then. Early marriage in Yemen, women and peace building in Mindanao and Philippines. Really, some really quite interesting stuff going on in terms of us understanding and not just giving up on entire faiths because we're not sure about their absolute women's rights. The fourth shock is a kind of slow motion train wreck. When I went back to reread the book, one of the biggest surprises was that it was talking about climate change in a future tense. If we don't get our carbon emissions down, all the predictions, the modelling, the IPCC, the UN predict that this is X, Y, Z is going to happen. What we now do is spend an awful lot of money actually dealing with climate change does happen, climate change adaptation. But it's a different picture from the one we had in 2008. I was in South Africa in March, and we got a phone call from partners in Zambia saying, we're getting frosts. We've never had frosts. The frosts are ruining the crops. What do we do about frost? So what you're seeing is climate chaos, increasingly erratic weather patterns, frosts and heat waves, drought and flood, all jammed together, playing havoc with traditional farming systems, because traditional farming is often rural farm stuff. It's when the winds change direction, that means the rains are coming, so I'm going to go and plough, and then when the first rain comes, I'm going to sow the seeds because I know there'll be 2 months of rain and I'll get a harvest. Now, if the winds change direction and then no rain comes, or the rain stops after a week, it completely messes up your ability to get a livelihood from your land. So we're doing a lot of things on things like putting farmers in touch with modern weather forecasting, which is better than nothing, just about. We're doing some interesting stuff. Well, it's not us actually. We were talking to some NGOs in Colombia